Hi, this is Hannah, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. You're listening to Root of Conflict, a podcast about violent conflict around the world and the people, societies, and policy issues it affects. In this series, you'll hear from experts and practitioners who conduct research, implement programs, and use data analysis to address some of the most pressing challenges facing our world. Root of Conflict is produced by UC3P in collaboration with the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflict, a research institute housed within the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. How does the United States coordinate with regional partners to promote human rights in North Korea? In this episode, we speak with Ambassador Julie Turner, the U.S. Special Envoy for North Korean Human Rights at the Department of State. Ambassador Turner is globally recognized as an expert in human rights and democracy, and has worked over the past 20 years to strengthen democratic institutions and promote human rights throughout the East Asia and Pacific region. As a career civil service employee and former presidential management fellow, Ambassador Turner has dedicated her career to advancing human rights around the world. We discuss how the United States and its allies in the region play a role in protecting and promoting human rights in North Korea, how the United States balances human rights with some of its hardline measures like economic sanctions and military deterrence, and how Ambassador Turner engages with the broader Korean American community. A note that the acronym DPRK refers to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the country's official title, which is also commonly referred to as North Korea. Hi, my name is Hannah Blickchi. I'm a second-year MPP student here at the Harris School of Public Policy, and I'm a Pearson Fellow.
My name is Chris Shin. I'm also a second-year MPP student, a Pearson Fellow at the University of Chicago, and I'm originally from Seoul, South Korea. Welcome to Chicago, Ambassador Turner.
Hi, my name is Levi Latos. I am a second-year MPP student here at the Harris School as well.
So thank you for joining us here, Ambassador Turner. Could you briefly introduce yourself for our audience and why you're here at UChicago today?
Yes, well, thank you for having me today. I'm excited to be on this podcast with you all. My name is Julie Turner. I'm the U.S. Special Envoy on North Korean human rights issues. And I'm here in Chicago because I am engaging with students, with the Korean American community, with North Korean refugees that live here in the greater Chicago area to talk about U.S. government efforts to support the reunification of divided families or separated families, as well as to talk about our policy on North Korean human rights and how people in Chicago, Korean Americans, but also non-Korean Americans, can help contribute to improving the lives of North Koreans.
Ambassador, your position as a special envoy had, until your appointment in 2023, remained vacant since 2017. Could you briefly share a bit about what a special envoy is and the significance of your recent appointment?
I want to make a joke about bureaucratic process and the title of special envoy, but I'll try to keep myself in line here with you guys today. But a special envoy is an individual that's appointed on behalf of the U.S. government to represent a particular issue that the administration or that the government feels needs more focused attention. My particular position was created by Congress under the North Korean Human Rights Act, and I was nominated in January 2023, but confirmed and sworn into my position in October of 2023. I have just dove into the issue and am hoping that some of these engagements that I'm doing help to do exactly what the position was mandated to do, which is to coordinate and promote efforts in the U.S. government to improve the lives of the North Korean people.
And for those that don't know, when was it mandated?
The North Korean Human Rights Act originally was passed in 2004.
Focusing on the work you're doing, building off of what you just said, can you take a moment to walk us through the U.S. foreign policy priorities for your position?
Yes. For my position, I have 5 areas that I've laid out as priority lines of effort. The first one is to work with partners and allies to raise international awareness of North Korea's human rights record And built into that effort, I would also include increasing the free flow of information into North Korea, independent information in particular. And so that particular effort has involved a lot of travel and coordination with partners in Europe, with the South Korean government, with the Japanese government, among others. The second line of effort is promoting accountability for those most responsible for human rights abuses in North Korea. And this has been a long time area of focus for the U.S. government. But one of the efforts that I have built into my own work has been to really amplify and lift up the voices of survivors in the conversation about accountability, to make sure that the process to achieving accountability is led by North Koreans. And so I've been doing a lot of engagements with North Korean refugees to better understand what they hope to see when we talk about accountability. The third line of effort is pressing for concrete change in North Korea. And this is the hardest one because it involves the North Koreans wanting to talk to me about what concrete change is. Right now, they've spent a little bit more time calling me names rather than demonstrating a willingness to engage. But I will again put out the same message that I've said over and over again, and that's that the U.S. government, including myself, stand ready to have a conversation with the North Koreans without preconditions. But in pressing for concrete change, we're looking for things that, like the repeal of the anti-reactionary thought law, for the repeal of the Pyongyang dialect law, or reforms to those pieces of legislation that would create space and freedom of expression that is actually severely restricted under those laws. The fourth area is helping to advocate on behalf of North Korean asylum seekers and refugees, or those individuals that are seeking protection abroad. And a lot of that has involved calling on the People's Republic of China and Russia to abide by the principle of non-refoulement and to stop forcibly returning North Korean refugees. And then the last area of work is one that is relatively new to the Special Envoy's mandate, and that is to engage with, to coordinate with the divided families community to better understand what their needs are, how many there are, and then to work together with the community to try to facilitate family reunions.
The State Department released the 2023 Country Reports on Human Rights Practices last week. I wondered if you could talk about what are the current trends of human rights in East Asia, and how do those relate to what you're observing in the DPRK?
Yeah, I think a couple of trends that I would say. One, I think we've all been talking about the rise of authoritarianism for the last few years. I don't think that Asia is an exception to that. I think we've seen it with coups in Burma and just other efforts undertaken by governments that further restrict freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, the fundamental freedoms. And, how this all relates or how it aligns with what we're seeing in North Korea, I think we've seen a lot of the similar restrictions or tightening of controls during COVID. They put into place the three so-called evil laws, the anti-reactionary thought law, the Pyongyang dialect law, and the youth education law. Somebody's going to correct me on that last one because I know I didn't get the official name right. But those three laws, which increase penalties for viewing foreign information, for using South Korean dialect words in North Korea, now you can be punished, or you can be punished for watching a K-drama. In fact, they earlier this year sentenced a handful of teenagers to 12 years of hard labor for watching essentially a K-drama. But I would also say there are other things that we're seeing in North Korea that overlap with things that we're seeing elsewhere, and that's cooperation with other authoritarian governments through the kind of transfer of technology, including specifically surveillance technology. There was recently a report that was released that highlights just increased observations of new surveillance cameras in North Korea that didn't exist pre-COVID, and other things that we're seeing in places like the PRC that are now appearing in North Korea, and also increased transnational repression. Sometimes, in some cases in Asia, it's looked like prisoner swaps, where one government says, hey, I've got somebody you want, you've got somebody that I want. We're holding them because they said something about the government. You're holding them because they illegally crossed a border. Let's just trade. The North Koreans are doing less trading, but more going to the Russians, going to the Chinese and saying, hey, we want these people back. And they're being sent back. And so those kind of things that extend, the types of repression that extends beyond one's territorial borders is an increasingly alarming trend that we're seeing more of.
Ambassador, you talked about the roles that the United States and its allies in the region play in protecting and promoting human rights in North Korea. But sometimes, given the foreign policy approaches, conflict with human rights advocacy, how should the U.S. and its allies balance some of the potential hardline policies, like economic sanctions or military deterrence, with continuous effort to advocate for human rights in North Korea?
So one of the things that I'm talking more and more about, and that the U.S. government is talking more and more about, something that we've said at the UN on a number of occasions, is the interconnectedness, the inextricable link between international peace and security and human rights. And so these things are tightly wound together, and we see this in the form of, for instance, North Korean overseas workers who are in conditions that amount to forced labor. They're dispatched overseas, they make money, they don't see a dime of that money gets sent back to the North Korean government, and that money is then being used to support the weapons program. We've seen recently reports through an organization called the Outlaw Oceans Project that highlighted North Koreans in Chinese seafood processing factories. We've seen a Reuters article earlier this year that highlighted North Korean workers making false eyelashes, beauty products that end up in U.S., South Korean, Japanese beauty markets. And all of that is being made with forced labor, and all of that forced labor is generating revenue that goes to the regime. And so I think the international community is coming or starting to at least circle around the consensus that interconnectedness exists. And I think that it's our responsibility now to continue to build out those examples and to underscore why it's imperative that governments around the world take action to address simultaneously the human rights situation and the security situation. To your point about sanctions versus like how that impacts the people, I do also want to underscore that the U.S. government sanctions, as well as the UN sanctions, have carve-outs for humanitarian purposes. None of our sanctions are targeting the people of North Korea. In fact, we very much do care about their welfare and want to protect their rights and to make sure that their needs are being met, which is why we have those carve-outs. But we also, at the same time, want to make sure that we're taking the steps necessary to help address the long-term security issues.
In what ways is the United States coordinating with its regional partners to promote human rights in the region? And do you see any potential opportunities to partner with the PRC on this matter, specifically in the context of the DPRK?
This is a good question. We're partnering with a number of partners and allies in the region on human rights. We have a number of human rights dialogues. We have consultations on democratic governance with the South Korean government. We have similar consultations with the government of Japan. You all have seen in the last few years that we have had a number of summits. We had the Yoon administration here We just recently had the Japanese government here for an official visit, helping to also amplify the effort that was undertaken in the trilateral meeting through the Spirit of Camp David joint statement. And so there's a lot of work to make sure that we're coordinated, that we're speaking with one voice on North Korea policy issues, but specifically also North Korean human rights issues. There's also an overlap in our interests here in that all three of our governments across that trilateral relationship have family groups that have been impacted by the North Korean government's repressive policies. That's for Japan, the abductees. For South Korea, it's divided families, abductees, detainees, POWs. And for the U.S., we also have the divided families issue, and so continuing to work together across governments to highlight how those policies, how the North Korea's restrictions on freedom of movement, how their censorship and surveillance have prevented families from communicating with each other, is a cross-cutting issue for all of us that we need to work together to advance. Now, in terms of China and China's role, I think we are looking for areas and ways in which we can cooperate with the PRC on North Korea specifically. It would be great if we could partner with them on human rights issues. That could include on the refugee situation, but could also be on talking about areas in which there might be potential for concrete change in North Korea. And that may be starting in an area that the U.S., the PRC, and the DPRK can all agree, maybe disability rights, an area where we're all doing work already. And so I will remain optimistic in that space. And, you know, the Secretary of State was just in China last week talking about North Korea. And I hope that we can carry forward some of the outcomes of that visit and make sure that we're working hand in hand on the North Korean human rights issue.
I know we have limited time with you, so we have a couple questions we ask every guest on our podcast, one of which being if there was one paper or book that you would recommend to young public policy students to read, about North Korean human rights or in advocacy or anything that you think would be helpful, what would you recommend?
This is a really tough one, and I don't want to endorse a particular one because I've read so many of them, and many of the North Korean refugees are dear friends of mine. And so, but I would just encourage students to pick up one of those books and to read about the life of a North Korean refugee, what that journey looked like from their earliest memories in North Korea to where they are today and how they got there. To be completely honest, having known some of the people whose memoirs I've read and having known them first and then going back and reading their books, it's pretty powerful stuff, especially comparing the person that I know today to this very unbelievable lived story, right? The obstacles that they had to overcome. Right. One of these individuals has talked about finding his human nature again, right? That North Korea, because of the competitiveness and survival mode that you have to be in at all times, it described how you almost become animal-like and how he had to become human again once he got to the United States. Knowing him now, he's one of the most wonderful human beings I know, and it's hard to believe that he had to live through what he lived through. And so I guess my real challenge is read one of those books, but also spend a couple of, an hour just talking to a North Korean refugee, because it puts just a completely different lens on the issue.
We'll try and put some links in the podcast information. Our final question for you is, what's something you wish we would have asked you?
That's another good one. It's a tough one. I think it's really about what you can do now as students. And part of my purpose in being here and doing outreach to university students, to the Korean American community, is really to push that call of action beyond governments, right? I mean, I definitely feel the pressure from civil society groups to do more, and they give me great recommendations for things that we can pursue in the multilateral space, bilateral conversations that we're having. But I'm really here to encourage you all and the other students and Korean Americans or diaspora Korean that I'm interacting with while I'm here in Chicago to take part in the effort to promote North Korean human rights. And you can do that there is a large refugee community here in Chicago. If it's tutoring a student, North Korean refugee who's trying to learn English, or helping Korean refugee get plugged into resources that they might need. A lot of them need legal assistance because they have pending asylum applications or just need to get a work authorization, which, is an arduous process here in the U.S. But also for those who are more on the policy side, to get involved in a human rights NGO, or to do more advocacy efforts. I won't mention any particular organizations, but I'm sure you all are familiar with some of them, and maybe you can also share some ideas in the links as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time today, really, and we'll be going to your talk at iHouse after this. Now let's go to a conversation between Ambassador Turner and Carl Friedhoff, who is the Marshall M. Booten Fellow for Asia Studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. This program was held at the University of Chicago's International House and hosted in partnership with the Center for East Asian Studies, the Posen Family Center for Human Rights, and the Asian Policy Forum.
So continuing on in the region, we talked a little bit about the state of democracy. This is obviously a big election year. It's not only the U.S., there are, I think, 50 elections around the world this year. There are more than half of the population is going to vote. We've already seen elections in South Korea, by-elections in Japan. Indonesia had an election, in India is coming up. What is the role of the United States in promoting democracy in the region? How does it pool its partners to do that? Is there a role for alliances? Obviously, the Biden administration has focused a lot on alliances, mostly on the security side of this. But in terms of pooling alliances in to focus on democracy and how we promote that and build a stronger network, so then you can then use that influence to then turn it on North Korea. Turn it on North Korea is a little bit of the wrong phrase, but.
Yes, absolutely. In terms of building upon pre-existing partnerships and alliances, we recently hosted the Japanese government for an official visit. We have during the Biden administration also hosted the Yoon administration for a state visit, and had numerous other both state visits but also efforts that we've undertaken to upgrade relationships. We have an expanded partnership with ASEAN now. We also have an upgraded relationship with Vietnam now. And so we're not just relying on the old partnerships, but also trying to build trust and confidence through expansion of new partnerships. And I think that the partnership with Vietnam and ASEAN are two perfect examples of that. In terms of election years and how we support democratic processes, I think one, it is support to civil society, because they are at the core the ones who are going to lead the way in building democratic institutions domestically in their home countries. Also, empowering and supporting independent press. These countries can have an informed citizenry, because informed citizenries are able to better engage with their governments, and to really demand responsive governance, which at the end of the day is what we're hoping to see more of. And that increases peace, stability, security.
So I'll pick up on two things there. You mentioned civil society and independent press, two things which obviously are very limited in North Korea. Is there a way to promote those inside of North Korea? Are there attempts to do that, or is at this point, is there more harm to be done in doing that because you put people at risk as you try to reach them and have them become more active in North Korea?
So I think right now it's very clear that there's a demand for independent information in North Korea. And I think that we can see that demand in the North Korean government's recent actions, because they've been tightening control of the information space. Human Rights Watch put out a report a couple of months ago about backsliding in North Korea's human rights situation during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're talking about one of the worst human rights crises in the world, and it got worse. The unimaginable happened. And the way I've interpreted their report is that COVID was the worst thing that could have happened to the North Korean people, but the best thing that could have happened to the North Korean government because it allowed for this tightening of repression. They put into place 3 new laws that increase penalties for viewing foreign media. We've seen them enforcing those laws. They put in place a shoot-to-kill order. So without a doubt, there is real fear on the North Korean government's side of this external flow of independent information. I think from our side, one of the areas that the US government has prioritized for many years through news outlets like Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, and also supporting independent refugee and defector-led groups that are based in Seoul is to just increase the amount of information that's out there. And then it's really up to the end user to decide whether or not they want to take the risk to take it. We don't want to inadvertently put somebody at risk by pushing information into the hands of an unwitting end user.
So on this rising middle class, I think that's an intriguing idea to think about, that there is this rising middle class there. Can you talk about where it is in North Korea? Is this a regional focus? Is it all Pyongyang, or is this also emanating out into the outer regions if there's a rising middle class there?
So I should clarify, I think that rising middle class existed, but is quickly being squashed. And I, particularly in recent months, the last time I was in Seoul, I had the opportunity to go to Hanwha and met with a couple of the groups that had come by sea directly from North Korea to the south last year. When I asked some of the younger generation, teenagers, I guess, amongst the group, they all told me food security was never an issue for them. Now, granted, these were people from southern part of the country who lived close to the ports, and so there probably was a lot more trade and other traffic going through. But they said food security wasn't an issue. They had cell phones, and we're living relatively decent lives. We're watching South Korean television. But for all of them, they said across the board, in 2023, that shifted. That the risk of watching South Korean TV became too great, which is also part of what led them to make the decision to leave. I want opportunity. I want a future. I can't have that here, so I'm going to go elsewhere. I asked one of them, I was like, oh, well, now you're here in South Korea. What's that opportunity that you want? Like, what do you want to do now that you're here? She's like, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. I just knew that I couldn't have whatever it was if I stayed in North Korea, and I'll figure it out now that I'm here.
So you mentioned Taiwan. I think for the audience, this is a place in South Korea where people have left North Korea, they come in, and I think they're in Taiwan about 6 months. And they go through things to kind of learn how to use an electronic banking system, and how daily life is going to work in South Korea. I was there about 10 years ago, and one of the things that is very obvious when you're at Hanwha is the gender disparity in the defectors that are there. You look at South Korea overall, the number of percentages of defectors that are in South Korea is about 70% are women. Can you talk a little bit about what drives that gender disparity and what drives women in particular to seek to cross, however they're going to get out, through China? Why do they seek to come to South Korea and take that risk? Why does
So I think there are probably a few factors with why the numbers are a little bit skewed right now, but I also want to tackle the issue of what the numbers look like right now in this very moment. Yeah. But I think historically you saw a wave of the numbers, if you go way back, were much higher amongst men. And then there was kind of the wave of women that followed, and then bringing children out after that. And so sometimes it was just the families coming in different tranches. There is also the issue of trafficking, and many of the women are trafficked into China and then sold into marriages. And the women that are sold into marriages oftentimes have children. who go unregistered in China and are then de facto stateless, which creates problems for resettlement because they don't have a nationality and can't get exit permission, and sometimes can't get entry permission to a third country. And so there are waves of problem with the trafficking, but that also leads to a disproportionate number of women in the border area. Many of them, after being trafficked, forced into marriages, having children, it takes between 5 and 10 years to save enough money to be able to make the difficult journey from northeastern China to a Southeast Asian country where they can get to South Korea or elsewhere. And so I think we're still seeing some of that wave right now. Many of the refugees that are arriving in Seoul have been in China for months right now. COVID did essentially shut down the refugee flows. When I was at Hanawan, most of the facility was empty, but it's quite possible that with the border slowly reopening, that will change. South Korean government has done an excellent job of keeping that facility up and fully functional and ready to support any number of North Koreans that may end up making their way to South Korea.
So when we think about human rights, I want to touch also on the U.S. policy side of this, not just the situation internally. You know, in the past, if you go back, I'm sure you've done this, talk to special envoys that were negotiators in 6-party talks, whether that's going back a while. But when you talk to them, they're all very clear that human rights was never raised as a part of the negotiations. And they're pretty unequivocal in the fact that they think, through their interactions with the North Koreans, that if human rights is raised, it's a non-starter, and North Korea will essentially get it from the table and leave. If we do enter negotiations at some point in the future, right now there are no negotiations, no known communications ongoing. If negotiations were to restart, how does the U.S. ensure, how do you work to ensure that human rights are now on the table and are going to be a part of any negotiating package moving forward?
So I think that the conversation around security and human rights has developed since the 6-party period in particular, and I think some of this came into light around 2014 when the UN Commission of Inquiry report was released, but also as the U.S. sought to work with partners to get North Korea's human rights situation added to the Security Council agenda. In order to have the Security Council talk or take a serious look at North Korea's human rights record, we had to build out the storyline of how North Korea's human rights record is connected to international peace and security, to be able to sway the votes that we need to be able to have that discussion every year. I think more recently, and this is something that the panel of experts had looked at or has looked at, is how North Korea dispatches overseas workers to China, to Russia. Those workers all work in conditions that amount to forced labor, which is a human rights abuse. So the North Korean government's human rights abuse in that situation then is generating revenue that the regime is using to support its weapons program. And so that shows some of that interconnectedness. I think we're seeing more of that now as well with Russia and North Korean military cooperation, where similarly North Korean weapons are now ending up in the hands of the Russians, which are then being launched into Ukraine and taking civilian lives in Ukraine. Also human rights abuse. Similarly, North Korean arms sales to Myanmar or Burma, where their junta there is also using North Korean-made products to kill innocent civilians in the course of their own domestic conflict. So the international community is beginning to see those threads, connecting these two issues more and more. I think how we continue to carry that forward is continuing to build out those connections, and that requires more of the security kind of world to be talking more to the human rights world about where these two things are overlapping. And we hope to, again, this year have another conversation about North Korean human rights at the Security Council.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Root of Conflict, featuring Ambassador Julie Turner. This episode was produced and edited by Hannah Balikci and Nishita Karun. Thank you to our interviewers, Levi Latos, Chris Shin, and Hannah Balikci. Special thanks to UC3P and the Pearson Institute for their continued support of this series. For more information on the Pearson Institute's research and events, visit their website, thepearsoninstitute.org, and follow them on Twitter @PearsonInst. Inst is spelled INST. Thank you.